They were the soundtrack to a generation, layered harmonies, timeless hooks, and a name that evoked unity. The Doobie Brothers weren't just a band, they were a brotherhood. Or so we were told. But what if that brotherhood was an illusion? What if behind the music, the lineup changes, and the radio hits was a quiet war? A decades-long story of rivalry, replacement, and betrayal. What really happened when Michael McDonald took the mic? Why did so many members walk away without saying a word? And why, after 50 years, are the Doobie Brothers finally admitting what fans never noticed? They were the band that defied definition, blue-collar rockers with California polish, a revolving door of musicians held together by smoke, soul, and a name that almost felt like a joke. But behind the layered harmonies and road-worn guitars, there was something else. Something no one ever talked about. Because from the very beginning, the Doobie Brothers weren't a brotherhood at all. They were a gamble. It started in 1970, in the dive bars of San Jose, California. Guitarist Tom Johnston, a wiry frontman with a voice like gravel soaked in bourbon, had a sound in his head. Roots rock, Southern-styled grooves, boogie rhythms, but polished, hook-driven, and marketable. He linked up with drummer John Hartman and guitarist Patrick Simmons, and together they formed what would become one of the most shape-shifting, genre-blending bands in American music history. They called themselves the Doobie Brothers, half ironic, half serious, a name born from a late-night stoner joke. Something about how they were always passing around joints in rehearsal. "Let's just call ourselves the Doobie Brothers until we think of something better," Johnston supposedly said. They never did. But the name stuck, and the music did too. Their first self-titled album barely registered. But by 1972, with the release of Toulouse Street, everything changed. Listen to the Music became a national anthem of sorts, an optimistic, freewheeling groove that hinted at unity in a divided time. By 1973's The Captain and Me, they were full-blown rock stars. Long Train Runnin', China Grove, South City Midnight Lady. Hit after hit spilled from their studio sessions, each one threaded with twin guitar melodies, gospel-tinged choruses, and a swagger that felt both Southern and West Coast. But even at their peak, something was fractured. Because beneath the Denim and Harmony facade, the Doobie Brothers were never a fixed unit. They were more like a constantly mutating organism, riddled with creative tension, ego clashes, and substance-fueled burnout. The lineup changed frequently. Members came and went. Some were fired, others left quietly, never fully understanding why. And in the early days, those changes were masked by momentum. The music was too good, the hits too steady, the label too happy. But that pace wasn't sustainable. Not for a band with no real leader, no vision beyond the next record, and no one willing to confront what was festering beneath the groove. Still, they toured. They recorded. They kept the machine rolling, even as personalities clashed and trust eroded. The fans never saw it. They didn't notice the rotating cast behind the microphones. They didn't question why a band of brothers seemed to never stay in the same room for more than a few years. Because the music kept coming. And the myth stayed alive. Until one voice changed everything. And with it, the truth began to fracture the harmony. It was 1975 when the wheels came off. Tom Johnston, the unmistakable voice behind the band's biggest hits, was burning out. Years of relentless touring, studio pressure, and drug use had taken a toll. By the time the band was prepping their next album, he was physically collapsing. A series of stomach ulcers sidelined him just as they were entering a critical phase. The band needed a new frontman. And fast. Enter Michael McDonald, a backup vocalist and keyboardist for Steely Dan, McDonald was brought in as a temporary replacement, just a session player, just to help with a few songs. But what came out of that session wasn't temporary. It was transformative. His voice, silky, melancholic, unmistakably soulful, shifted the band's entire sound. Gone were the sharp guitar riffs and raw road anthems. In their place came lush chord progressions, smooth keyboards, and a haunting depth that the band had never explored before. It was sophisticated, it was introspective, it was pop. 1976's Takin' It to the Streets wasn't just a new album, it was a rebirth. Critics praised the evolution. Sales soared. And McDonald, with his piercing blue eyes and quiet demeanor, became the reluctant face of a new era. But not everyone was clapping. Inside the band, the shift was seismic. What had once been a rugged rock outfit was now veering into yacht rock territory. The original members, guys who had built their identity around backbeats and bar brawls, felt alienated. Simmons tried to adapt. Hartman stayed quiet. Others drifted away, disillusioned. The label didn't care. Neither did radio. McDonald's era was a commercial goldmine. It keeps you running, minute by minute. What a Fool Believes. Each hit further cemented McDonald's dominance. He wasn't just singing. He was writing, producing, leading. The Doobie Brothers had become, whether anyone said it out loud or not, his band, and Tom Johnston, he was watching from the sidelines. For a while, he tried to rejoin, but the sound had moved on. There was no place for his rock and roll grit in this new landscape. He had been replaced, not just as a singer, but as an identity. The betrayal wasn't direct. There were no shouting matches, no public breakups, just silence and exclusion. To fans, it seemed seamless, an evolution, a band maturing. But behind the scenes, it was seen for what it truly was, a coup, and no one had the courage or the contract to stop it. By 1979, the Doobie Brothers were unrecognizable. What had begun as a group of long-haired, denim-clad jam rockers had become a studio-perfect, Grammy-winning juggernaut powered almost entirely by one man. Michael McDonald's Minute by Minute won them 4 Grammy Awards, including Record of the Year for What a Fool Believes, and catapulted the band to a level of prestige they had never reached before. But while the world celebrated the band's transformation, inside the group, it was war by silence. Patrick Simmons, the last remaining founding member, kept the ship afloat by sheer will. He straddled the old and new eras with weary pragmatism, playing the diplomat between two factions. The old guard, who saw McDonald as a hijacker, and the newer members who owed their careers to him. Johnston, now a footnote in the band's trajectory, was barely spoken of. Old interviews from the era refer to him vaguely, sometimes with a hint of sadness, sometimes with frustration. Things just changed, Simmons said in one of the few honest interviews from the time. The sound evolved. Not everyone wanted to evolve with it. McDonald didn't gloat. He never had to. His songs said it all. And that's what made it worse. Because for the original Doobies, it wasn't just about sound. It was about identity, brotherhood, shared sweat and sacrifice. Now, that identity had been overwritten by chart-friendly soul ballads and session musicians with clean shirts and clean records. There was never an official confrontation. No band meeting where grievances were aired. That would have been honest. Instead, there were rewrites, schedule changes, reassignments. Slowly and with surgical precision, the old Doobie Brothers were phased out. The fans barely noticed. The music was still good. The name was still there. But the brotherhood? That was long gone. And by the time the band officially split in 1982, the public was told it was mutual. Creative burnout. Time for a break. What they weren't told was that the band had collapsed under its own contradictions. that it had become too big to sustain the lies it was built on, and that the name Doobie Brothers had become a brand, one that no longer represented anyone involved. So what was left? A legacy, a catalog of hits, a name that sold tickets, and two men, one who started the fire, the other who redirected its flame, who would never see eye to eye again. In the years following the band's initial split in 1982, a strange quiet descended over the legacy of the Doobie Brothers, a kind of manufactured peace that settled over the ashes of the band's implosion. Fans assumed it had been a natural end, a graceful retirement, but those on the inside knew better. Michael McDonald didn't leave the band. He removed himself. The official narrative was that the group was exhausted, that the pressures of touring and creative demands had simply worn everyone down. But insiders tell a different story. By 1981, McDonald had grown tired, not just of the music, but of the pretense. He had become the reluctant emperor of a kingdom that resented his crown. He was never meant to be a Doobie Brother. Brought in as a stand-in for a sick Tom Johnston, McDonald's presence had always been conditional, temporary, but talent and ego have a way of upending plans. His voice transformed their sound, yes, but his precision, his perfectionism, his unwillingness to tour endlessly or compromise artistically created a tension the band had never known before. The original Doobies were loose, spontaneous. They jammed, they improvised, they partied. McDonald? He rehearsed, he rewrote, he demanded silence during vocal takes. For a band built on brotherhood, his arrival felt more like a corporate merger, profitable, efficient, sterile. And as the band continued to rack up hits under McDonald's creative direction, the line between success and sacrifice grew blurrier. By the time they hit the road in 1981, it was no longer a band, it was a battlefield. The crew could sense it. Band members spoke in clipped sentences. Sound checks were silent. There were no hangouts, no jokes, no camaraderie. Only set lists and stage times. McDonald, though polite, kept to himself. He traveled separately, ate separately, left immediately after each performance. The others noticed, but no one confronted him. It wasn't just that he had become the frontman. It was that he had become untouchable. So when McDonald announced in early 1982 that he was done, no one stopped him. He walked away without drama, without interviews, without a farewell tour. He simply vanished from the band, just as he had appeared. And the moment he left, it was as if a spell had been broken. The band dissolved within weeks, but here's what most fans never noticed. McDonald didn't just leave the Doobie Brothers, he took their future with him. Because after his departure, the band attempted multiple revivals. None stuck. Johnston came back briefly. Simmons tried leading. They toured small venues, re-recorded old hits, leaned into nostalgia, but the energy was gone. What had once been a vehicle for musical brotherhood had become a franchise, a jukebox of memories, a legacy band, and the one man who had taken it to its highest heights. He never looked back. McDonald went on to solo success, Grammy nominations, film soundtracks, collaborations with everyone from Patti LaBelle to James Ingram. He became the voice of a generation, but not a brother. Never again a Doobie Brother. He had outgrown the name. And for those who had given their youth, their sweat, their identity to that name, it was an abandonment they never spoke of, but never forgave. It's not listed in any official band biography. It's not mentioned in Rolling Stone retrospectives or anniversary interviews. But in late 1981, before the public knew the band was dissolving, there was a meeting, a private one, held at a hotel conference room in Los Angeles. The label executives were there. So were the core band members, Simmons, McDonald, and Johnston, who had tentatively returned after several years on the sidelines. What was said behind closed doors was never recorded, but fragments of the conversation leaked out over the years, in interviews, in memoirs, in drunken confessions backstage. Here's what we know. There was talk of direction, of whether the band should double down on the McDonald era or return to their roots. Johnston, still bitter about being sidelined, argued for reclaiming the original sound. Simmons, tired of the infighting, suggested a hybrid approach. McDonald listened quietly. Then, calmly, he declined. Not just the idea, the band itself. He said he was done, that he'd fulfilled his role, that the Doobie Brothers were something I helped shape, not something I wanted to be tied to. The room fell silent. The label, blindsided, pleaded with him to reconsider. Touring revenue was at its peak. A new album was nearly finished. McDonald shook his head. It's not who I am. And with that, the meeting ended. The band made no announcement, no press release. The breakup happened in slow motion. Shows were canceled, plans were delayed, and by the time it became clear that the group had ceased to exist, no one could say exactly when it ended. That was the brilliance and the cruelty of the decision. It left no scar, just confusion. The fans never got closure. The band never got justice. And the story of the Doobie Brothers ended not with a bang, but with a vanishing. But inside that room, what really fractured wasn't just a band. It was trust. Johnston would later describe that era as the moment I realized this was never about the music. It was about the machine. Simmons, more diplomatic, said simply, I don't think any of us were happy. And McDonald? He never mentioned the meeting, never acknowledged the fallout, because for him, there was no breakup. There was only escape. In the wake of the dissolution, something strange happened. The Doobie Brothers, now fractured and dormant, became more popular than ever. Their records saw a sales spike. Greatest hits compilations flew off the shelves. Radio stations dedicated weekend-long marathons to their music. The public, unaware of the internal collapse, assumed the band was just taking a breather. But inside the remaining circle, those who had been there since the dive bars and smoke-filled studios, a new kind of bitterness took root, toxic loyalty. It manifested as denial. Despite knowing that the brotherhood was gone, many members clung to the image. They defended the band publicly. They honored the name. Even as solo careers failed to launch, even as reunion offers trickled in and were rejected, they refused to tarnish the legacy. They protected it like a wounded animal. Simmons, who stayed active in music, spent years deflecting hard questions. He insisted the group was just on hiatus. He praised McDonald in interviews, called him a genius. But his eyes always said something else. Johnston became more vocal, especially in the 90s, when nostalgia tours began to resurface. He criticized the industry, the decisions, the shift in sound. But even he stopped short of naming the betrayal, because to say it out loud would be to destroy the myth. And the myth, by then, was all they had. The brotherhood had become a brand, a product. And if they dismantled it publicly, there would be nothing left. So they stayed loyal to the name, to the logo, to the illusion, even if it meant lying, even if it meant performing next to people they resented, even if it meant watching a legacy they helped build be credited to someone else. It was a loyalty born not from love, but from loss, and it poisoned everything it touched. Because the truth was never just about the music. It was about who got to own it, who got to live it, and who had to watch from the sidelines while the world sang along. In 2004, during the band's induction into the Vocal Group Hall of Fame, one former member's speech stood out, not for what he said, but for what he refused to say. Tiran Porter, bassist for the Doobie Brothers from 1972 to 1980, had played on nearly every classic track. His deep, Funk-infused lines gave the band's sound its subtle swagger. But by the late 70s, Porter had grown distant, disillusioned, silenced. That night, as the band gathered for photos and polite applause, Porter stepped to the mic with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's good to be remembered," he said. "Some of us weren't." The crowd chuckled awkwardly, but Porter wasn't joking. Later that evening, in a backstage interview with a local journalist, he opened up, quietly, cautiously, but with unmistakable conviction. "The public never saw what was happening," he said. "They just heard the records. But behind the scenes, it wasn't a band, it was a hierarchy, and you had to know your place." Porter had never been one for drama. He rarely gave interviews and largely avoided press after leaving the group. But that night, he left no doubt. The story of the Doobie Brothers, as fans knew it, was incomplete. He spoke about the shift, how, under McDonald's rising influence, musical decisions became centralized, how members who once jammed freely were now reading charts they hadn't written, how sessions became tense, impersonal. "We were no longer collaborators," Porter said. "We were instruments, hired hands." His departure in 1980 wasn't due to exhaustion, as officially stated. It was due to invisibility. He had grown tired of playing parts in songs he no longer connected to, watching as others made the creative calls, while the founding ethos of the band eroded under polished chord progressions and synthesizer pads. But the most chilling part of his reflection was the warning he issued. "Don't believe in brotherhood just because it's on the album cover," he said. "If you're not careful, you'll spend your whole career chasing someone else's dream, and wake up one day realizing you never lived your own." It wasn't a headline moment. No cameras captured it. No retrospectives included it. But among insiders, that speech became legendary. Tiran Porter had said the quiet part out loud, and in doing so, he exposed a deeper truth, that the rot within the Doobie Brothers wasn't caused by ego alone. It was caused by silence, by decades of members swallowing betrayal, painting over wounds, and calling it professionalism. By the time he walked off that stage, the audience had already moved on, applauding the next speaker, posing for pictures. But Porter's warning hung in the air, and for those willing to listen, it changed everything. The year was 2010. The Doobie Brothers were back on tour, this time as a legacy act, leaning hard into the nostalgia circuit. The lineup had rotated yet again. Johnston was back. Simmons too. McDonald was not. It was, as one critic put it, the closest thing to the original sound we're ever going to get. But backstage, the mood was anything but celebratory. Sources close to the crew described the atmosphere as strained. The band was tight on stage, but off stage? Cold, distant. Each member operated like a separate entity, rehearsing alone, traveling separately, often avoiding eye contact altogether. One night, during a stop in Chicago, a longtime road manager reportedly overheard Simmons and Johnston talking quietly in the green room. They were discussing the early days, the tours with McDonald, the fractured dynamics. Then Johnston said something no one expected. "I think we all pretended it was worth it." Simmons didn't respond. He just nodded. That same night, an impromptu meeting happened between the newer members and crew. Some had grown frustrated with the tension. Why were the founders so guarded? Why did everything feel like a funeral march? A tech asked bluntly, "Why don't they just talk to each other? Clear the air?" Another member, who joined in the late 90s, gave a quiet answer. Because they already did. And it didn't help. Years earlier, during a brief 1995 reunion with McDonald for the Rockin' Down the Highway tour, the band had sat down for what was described as a deep talk. All cards on the table, past grievances aired, resentments voiced. It ended in silence. No one yelled. No one cried. They simply realized they would never agree. Johnston felt betrayed. McDonald felt unappreciated. Simmons was caught in the middle. Nothing was resolved. nothing was healed. The confessions were made, but they changed nothing because, as one member later put it, apologies don't erase history, and brotherhood isn't a feeling, it's a choice, one they stopped making a long time ago. The tour continued. The shows were successful. Fans never knew. But behind every encore, there were invisible walls, wounds disguised as professionalism. A brotherhood that once thrived on shared struggle, now reduced to signed contracts and timed entrances. And in that quiet failure to reconcile, another truth emerged. The Doobie Brothers hadn't just fallen apart. They'd learned how to keep performing inside the wreckage. In 2020, the Doobie Brothers announced their 50th anniversary tour. For the first time in decades, McDonald would officially rejoin them on stage. The announcement sent shockwaves through the music world. Fans rejoiced. Critics sharpened their pens. This was more than a reunion. It was a resurrection. But behind the curtain, tensions reawakened. Rehearsals were reportedly cordial but cold. McDonald arrived with his usual professionalism, polite, focused, reserved. Johnston, visibly older but still sharp, kept things businesslike. Simmons tried to bridge the energy, but there was no real warmth, just history. They practiced the hits, went through the set list, smiled for press photos, but off stage, they moved like strangers in a house they once shared. During one rehearsal, a production assistant noted the interaction between McDonald and Johnston. They never stood next to each other. Not once. They'd nod, say, "Good take," and that was it. Decades of music between them, and not one real conversation. Still, the tour was a success. Sell-out crowds, roaring ovations. Reviewers praised the band's chemistry, called it a triumphant reunion of musical soulmates. But it wasn't a reunion, it was a performance. The crowd never noticed the distance. How could they? The music was perfect, harmonies tight, solos sharp, smiles wide. But in every shared spotlight, in every closing bow, the truth remained. They had learned to coexist in silence. No one raised old grievances. No one demanded apologies. They simply played the roles the world expected of them. And in doing so, they revealed a darker truth about legacy. That it's not built on reconciliation, it's built on repetition. Play the hits. Smile for the camera. Move on. It wasn't until 2023 that a fan uncovered something strange. An overlooked comment in an old interview buried in a local radio archive from 1983. McDonald had been asked what he thought Doobie Brothers meant after all those years. He laughed, then paused. "It means pretending we were ever really a band." At the time, no one noticed. The comment was never printed. It faded into static. But decades later, it resurfaced, and it changed everything. Because that single sentence reframed the entire narrative. What if the Doobie Brothers were never truly brothers? What if the sound that defined a generation was built on fragments, on a collective of players, producers, and personalities that never fully aligned? What if the thing fans loved most, the unity, the harmony, the chemistry, was the biggest illusion of all? Not a lie, just a performance. In interviews that followed, Simmons would quietly admit, "We never talked about it. We just kept going." Johnston, more blunt, "People think we're all friends. We're not. We're co-workers." And McDonald? He never commented again. Because the final revelation isn't some buried secret or scandalous betrayal. It's the truth, hiding in plain sight. That the Doobie Brothers were never one thing. They were a sound, a brand, a compromise. And while the music remains, immortal, irresistible, beloved, the myth behind it has finally unraveled. The brotherhood never was. They sold millions, toured the world, defined a sound. But behind the harmonies and gold records was a fractured reality. A legacy built on silence, substitutions, and survival. What's left when the myth of brotherhood fades? Comment your thoughts, Subscribe for more buried truths, and remember, not all legends are what they seem.